The espresso machine hissed at 8:12 in the morning, and 3 seconds later the most powerful man in Charlotte, North Carolina raised his hand and struck a black woman across the face in front of 41 witnesses. He said she had ruined his suit, a suit that cost $6,000, a suit that by the end of that year would matter to absolutely no one. Nobody in the Ember and Oak coffee house moved. Nobody spoke. A barista mid-pour simply stopped pouring, and the coffee overflowed the cup and ran across the counter in a thin brown river that nobody wiped up for almost a full minute. Everyone in that room understood exactly whose name was stitched into the lining of that jacket, and exactly what that name could do to a mortgage, a job, a small business lease renewal. Then the bodyguards, and standing 2 feet behind him, looked down at the woman's wrist, where her sleeve had ridden up when she raised her arm to protect her face. He saw a thin, pale, lightning-shaped scar running from the base of her palm to the crook of her elbow. His coffee cup slipped out of his hand. It didn't shatter loudly. It made a small, almost polite sound against the tile, and somehow that quiet sound was more frightening than a scream would have been. "Sir," he said, and his voice cracked in the middle of the word. "Do you have any idea who you just hit?" Nobody answered him. Not yet, because the woman on the floor, holding her own cheek, hadn't said a word either. The city outside kept moving the way cities always do, indifferent to whatever is falling apart behind glass storefronts. Buses hissed at their stops on Tryon Street. A man in a reflective vest hustled down a sidewalk 2 doors down, unaware that in 19 minutes, his phone would start buzzing with a video he hadn't filmed. Nobody walking past the corner of 5th and Tryon that Tuesday morning could have guessed that this particular glass storefront was about to become the center of a story that would run on every local news channel by 6 o'clock and on national television by Thursday. Stories like that rarely send a warning. They arrive wearing the clothes of an ordinary Tuesday. Her name was Denise Coleman. She was 36 years old. And on that morning, she wore nothing that announced money or power: a charcoal wool coat, 2 winters old, flat black shoes with a worn heel, and a canvas messenger bag with a strap that had been stitched back together so many times the thread had turned a different color than the fabric around it. She had carried that bag for 11 years. She had refused 3 separate offers from friends to buy her a new one. Denise walked into Ember and Oak the way she walked into every room in her life. Without asking anyone to look at her, and without particularly caring if they did, she had a meeting in 40 minutes, 3 blocks away, with a state funding committee that controlled $200,000 her organization needed to survive the winter. She ordered a plain black coffee, sat near the window, and pulled her phone, screen webbed with a crack she'd never bothered to fix, out of her bag to review her notes one more time. She had no idea that in less than 20 minutes, her face would be the most searched name in the state of North Carolina. Bradley Whitfield walked in at 8:09. The temperature of the room seemed to drop 3 degrees the moment the door swung shut behind him. He was 47, chief executive of Whitfield Dynamics Group, a logistics and manufacturing conglomerate his father had built from a single textile mill in Gastonia 60 years earlier. His face had been on the cover of a regional business magazine 4 times. He was a man who did not wait in lines, did not apologize twice, and had once fired a marketing director over a font choice. He arrived flanked by 2 junior assistants and a single bodyguard, Nathaniel Cross, a broad-shouldered man with a scar of his own along his jaw, who had worked at Bradley's side for 9 years and had never once seen him show real fear. Heads turned. Phones came out. Not to film yet, just because people recognized him. The shift manager came out from the back office to personally greet him, because everyone in that cafe understood the unwritten rule. Men like Bradley Whitfield did not stand behind other people in line. It happened in 4 seconds. A 19-year-old barista rushing to restock the pastry case collided with a coworker carrying a full pot of drip coffee. The pot tipped. Scalding liquid arced sideways and landed across the sleeve and lapel of Bradley's charcoal suit. He didn't see the collision. He didn't see the barista at all. All he saw was Denise Coleman, who happened to be rising from her chair at that exact instant to reach for a napkin dispenser 6 feet away. In the half-second before reason could catch up to fury, she became, in his mind, the entire explanation. He spun toward her, his face contorted with an anger completely disproportionate to a few drops of coffee, and demanded, loudly enough that 3 tables turned, to know what the hell she thought she was doing. Denise didn't flinch. She told him, calmly, that she hadn't touched him, that the spill had come from behind the counter, that she'd only just stood up. She had learned, a long time ago, and in far worse rooms than this one, exactly how to keep her voice level when everything around her wasn't. But Bradley wasn't listening. He had already decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly what had happened and exactly who was going to pay for it. Watch her hands right now. Because in about 11 seconds, everyone in this cafe is going to remember exactly where they were standing, for the rest of their lives. "You people," he said, and the room went very still at those 2 words. "Always think someone else is going to clean up after you." Nathaniel took 1 step forward. He didn't yet understand what he was stepping toward. And then, before anyone could process it, before a single hand could reach out to stop him, Bradley Whitfield raised his palm and struck Denise Coleman across the face. The sound seemed to hang in the air far longer than it should have. A woman near the pastry case gasped and pressed both hands over her mouth. Somewhere near the back wall, a phone was already raised, recording, capturing every second of what would become the most watched 16 seconds of video in the history of the local news station's website. Denise's head turned slightly from the force of it. For a moment, nobody in that cafe breathed, waiting to see whether she would cry, whether she would scream, whether she would simply gather her things and disappear, the way the world so often expects women who look like her to disappear. She did none of those things. She straightened her spine, she lifted her chin, and she looked directly into Bradley Whitfield's eyes with a stillness that unsettled every single person watching far more than tears ever could have. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten him with lawyers or cameras or consequences that would have sounded hollow in that moment anyway. She said quietly enough that people had to lean in to hear it. "You just made the worst mistake of your entire life, and you don't even know it yet." Then she picked up her bag, the one with the mended strap, and walked toward the door, leaving behind a room full of people who would spend the rest of the day unable to talk about anything else. Bradley laughed it off the way. Men who have never faced a real consequence tend to laugh off warnings they don't understand. He straightened his ruined jacket, muttered something about people who manufactured drama for attention, and told one of his assistants to find him a new suit before his 9:30. A few people in the cafe exchanged uneasy glances. Nobody said a word to him directly. After all, this was a man who sat on 4 regional boards, whose name was on the children's wing of a hospital, who could end a career with 1 phone call before lunch. Nathaniel Cross had not laughed. He stood frozen near the entrance, staring at the space where Denise's forearm had been visible for exactly 2 seconds before she lowered her sleeve. A thin, pale scar, curved like a lightning bolt, running from her wrist to the inside of her elbow. The kind of scar that does not come from a kitchen accident or a fall off a bicycle. He had seen that exact scar once before in his life. 16 years earlier, under circumstances he had spent every one of those 16 years trying and failing not to remember. His chest tightened. The cafe blurred at the edges. Somewhere behind his eyes, smoke rolled across a stairwell that had buckled from heat, and men were screaming behind a door that would not open. He moved fast, catching Denise just before she disappeared into the sidewalk crowd on Tryon Street. His voice shook as he asked her a single question. 6 words that would have meant nothing to anyone else on that block. A phrase shared only between people who had once survived something together that neither of them had ever spoken about since. Denise stopped walking. She turned slowly, and she gave him the exact answer he had spent 16 years, both hoping and dreading to hear. Nathaniel's hands started to shake. He had believed, for a decade and a half, that the woman who pulled him out of a burning building had either vanished completely or hadn't survived that night at all. And here she was, standing on an ordinary sidewalk, rubbing her cheek, where his own employer had just struck her. He turned back toward the cafe, where Bradley stood impatiently waiting for a fresh deck jacket, having no idea whatsoever that the stranger causing a scene was about to unravel everything he believed about the empire bearing his name. Nathaniel walked back inside. His expression had changed so completely that Bradley stopped mid-sentence to look at him. "We need to talk. Right now." Nathaniel's voice was low, flat, urgent, in a way Bradley had never heard from him in 9 years. Not during board disputes, not during the 2A. Call about the warehouse fire in Rock Hill, not ever. Something in that tone made even Bradley Whitfield, a man unaccustomed to being told what to do by anyone on his payroll, fall silent and follow him to a corner of the cafe. Bradley's irritation flared the second they were alone. His patience already thin from the ruined suit and the inconvenience of the entire morning. He demanded to know why his own bodyguard was making a scene over some woman who was clearly looking for an excuse. Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He asked Bradley to sit down, and something in the rare seriousness on his face made Bradley comply without his usual sarcasm. What Nathaniel said next would change the trajectory of everything that followed, though neither man yet understood how far the damage would spread. 16 years earlier, before he had ever worn a suit or carried a radio for a man like Bradley Whitfield, Nathaniel Cross had been a rescue technician with the Gastonia Fire Department. The kind of job that requires a person to run into buildings other people are running out of. One December night, the Whitfield Textile Mill on the edge of Gastonia, a facility owned at the time by Bradley's father, Walter Whitfield, caught fire after an equipment malfunction on the 3rd floor. 41 workers were trapped on the upper level, behind a stairwell that had already buckled from the heat. Nathaniel had been on the crew sent in, and within minutes the operation had gone catastrophically wrong. Smoke thickened faster than anyone had predicted. Exits collapsed one after another. He remembered it with a clarity that had never once faded, no matter how many years passed. In the middle of that chaos, a young woman, who had no business being anywhere near a burning building, had appeared out of the smoke, guiding trapped workers through a service corridor that wasn't even on the building's official rescue maps. She moved with a calm that defied everything Nathaniel had been trained to expect from a civilian in a fire, pulling people through narrow gaps, carrying a 9-year-old boy on her back through smoke so thick that trained firefighters were struggling to breathe. At one point, a section of ceiling gave way. A falling steel bracket tore across her forearm, opening a wound deep enough that Nathaniel, even in the chaos, assumed she would lose the arm entirely. She did not stop moving. She kept guiding survivors down that corridor until every single person on that floor had made it out. Only then did she let anyone look at the wound. And by the time emergency crews tried to get her name for the official report, she had already slipped away into the crowd outside, gone before a single reporter or official could catch up to her. The story became something close to local legend among the firefighters who'd been there that night. The woman with no name, who had saved an entire floor of workers and disappeared before anyone could thank her. Nathaniel had searched for her quietly for years. He never found a single solid lead. He had long since made peace with the idea that he would never know who she was. And now, 16 years later, he had watched his own employer strike her across the face over a coffee stain. Bradley sat very still while Nathaniel spoke. Something uncomfortable was shifting behind his eyes. The name Denise Coleman tugged at a memory he couldn't quite place. Something tied to old files he'd seen once, years ago, and never thought about again. Something connected to the early history of his father's company. He didn't yet understand the connection. But a cold unease was already settling into his chest, the first real crack in the certainty that had carried him through every confrontation of his adult life. Nathaniel finally looked his employer directly in the eye. "The woman you just hit," he said, "is the reason I'm alive to be standing in this room telling you about it." Bradley spent the rest of that day distracted in a way his staff had never witnessed. He snapped at no one, sat through 2 board calls in near total silence, and left the office at 4:40 p.m., 3 hours earlier than usual, without explanation. That night, he asked his most trusted assistant, a 28-year-old named Priya Anand, to quietly pull every archived record connected to the Gastonia mill fire. It was a request that sent her into a climate-controlled storage facility on the edge of the city, digging through boxes that had not been opened in over a decade. What she found by 7 a.m. the next morning unsettled even her, and she carried the documents into Bradley's office with visible hesitation, unsure how her employer would react to what they revealed. The Whitfield Textile Mill that burned 16 years earlier had belonged, at the time, to a company his father owned outright. A fact Bradley had either forgotten or never fully registered as a 29-year-old more concerned with his own rise through the executive ranks than with operations at a single regional facility. The fire had nearly destroyed the entire company. Lawsuits, insurance collapse, a public relations disaster that could have ended the Whitfield family business, a full decade before Bradley ever inherited a single share of it. Yet the company had survived, largely because the death toll had been far lower than first reports predicted, a fact the internal documents attributed directly to the unexplained intervention of an unidentified young woman who had guided dozens of workers through a corridor nobody else on staff had known existed. Bradley read through the file twice. His hands gripped the edges of the pages. If that fire had claimed the lives originally feared, the lawsuits alone would have bankrupted Whitfield Dynamics before it ever became Whitfield Dynamics. There would be no headquarters tower downtown, no board seats, no hospital wing with his family's name carved into limestone above the entrance. Every interview he'd ever given about his own grit, his own instincts, his own hard-earned rise, none of it accounted for a fire, a stranger, and a debt his family had never once acknowledged, let alone repaid. The deeper Priya dug, the worse it got. Internal memos from 16 years ago showed that company executives had, in fact, discussed locating the woman who'd saved the workers, to offer compensation, maybe even a public reward, partly out of decency and partly as good publicity for a company recovering from disaster. But the paper trail simply stopped. No follow-up, no settlement, no payment of any kind to anyone matching her description. One memo, dated 3 weeks after the fire, noted flatly that the search for the unidentified woman had been deprioritized due to more pressing operational matters. A single line. Bradley read it 4 times, struck by how easily a debt that enormous had been filed away and forgotten by people who had never once had to live with the consequences of forgetting it. Denise Coleman, whoever had raised her, whatever life she'd built since that night, had received nothing. Not a dollar, not a letter, not even an acknowledgement that the company understood what she'd done. Bradley sat alone in his office long after his staff had gone home, staring at a black and white photograph from the company archive, the burned skeleton of the mill's third floor. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to shame settle into his chest, heavy and unfamiliar. He'd spent his entire adult life believing his success had been earned through his own intelligence and his own discipline. In a single night, he had learned that the very ground beneath his empire had been secured by a woman he had publicly humiliated over a stain on his jacket. But knowing something in private and being made to answer for it in public are two very different kinds of reckoning. And Bradley Whitfield's public reckoning had already started, whether he was ready for it or not. By the time Priya walked out of his office that morning, the video from Ember and Oak had already been viewed 2 million times. The clip had been posted at 9:40 the previous night by the customer who'd filmed it, a graduate student named Aisha Bell, who had captioned it with 4 words. He just hit her. By dawn, it had been picked up by 3 separate local news accounts, then a national morning show's social media team, then a media personality with 11 million followers who posted it with the caption, "Watch how fast money makes a man forget he's human." Commentators dissected every second of footage, frame by frame. Analysts speculated on air about what it meant for Whitfield Dynamics' upcoming shareholder meeting. Within 72 hours, the company's stock had dropped 9%, as investors grew nervous about the storm gathering around their chief executive. Journalists who had spent careers covering corporate scandal recognized an opportunity too large to ignore. And within 4 days, a persistent local reporter named Owen Marsh had identified Denise Coleman by name, tracing her back to a small nonprofit she'd founded and quietly run for 11 years, out of a strip mall office on the edge of the city. What he found stunned even him. The woman struck on camera by one of the most powerful executives in the Carolinas turned out to be the same woman whispered about for 16 years in Gastonia firehouse break rooms, the nameless hero of a textile mill fire that had nearly ended a company before it became an empire. Public reaction shifted overnight from outrage over a single slap to something far bigger. A collective fascination with a woman who had quietly saved 41 lives and asked for nothing, only to be humiliated years later by the very system her sacrifice had helped preserve. Local headlines called her the forgotten hero of Gastonia. Strangers who had never met her began sharing the donation link for her nonprofit, the Second Chance Workers Alliance, and money that had trickled in for a decade at a rate of maybe $4,000 a month suddenly arrived in 6 figures within 72 hours. Talk shows debated the footage. Editorial columns argued about what the moment revealed about wealth, race, and the assumptions powerful men carry into ordinary rooms without ever once questioning them. A petition demanding Bradley's removal from his own board crossed 80,000 signatures by the end of the week, and Bradley, watching all of it unfold from behind the glass wall of his own office, understood, for the first time in his adult life, that the consequences of a single bad morning had only just begun. Here is the part almost nobody outside that boardroom knew yet. The part that turned this from a scandal into something far more dangerous for Bradley Whitfield. Because the story wasn't finished revealing itself. Not even close. It was during that first surge of public attention that Owen Marsh, digging deeper into the original fire investigation, uncovered something that complicated everything even further. Old commendation records showed that someone else entirely had received official credit for guiding those 41 workers to safety that night. Someone who had, according to every first-hand account Nathaniel and other survivors gave, not actually been inside the building during the critical minutes of the rescue at all. That man's name was Gregory Sanford, a former operations director at the mill who had, over the 16 years since, built an entire second career on the reputation of being the man who saved his workers that night. He had accepted a regional safety medal from the state fire marshal's office. He had received a substantial bonus from Whitfield Dynamics, grateful at the time for limiting its legal exposure. He had used the story in keynote speeches, in a self-published leadership book, in 2 later business ventures that traded almost entirely on his invented legend. For 16 years, Denise Coleman had said nothing. She had never once stepped forward to correct the record. Content, it seemed, to disappear rather than fight for credit she had apparently never wanted in the first place. When Owen Marsh confronted Gregory Sanford, with survivor testimony contradicting his long-told story, Sanford denied everything, calling the claims the confused memories of traumatized workers, recalling a chaotic night imperfectly. But as more survivors came forward, each independently describing the same young woman, the same severe wound to her forearm, the same child carried on her back through smoke, the cracks in his story became impossible to explain away. Nathaniel, watching the investigation unfold with a fury that had been sitting in his chest for 16 years, agreed to go on the record, for the first time, about what he had witnessed that night. His testimony carried a particular weight because, unlike almost everyone else involved, he had absolutely nothing personal to gain from telling the truth. Bradley, still working through his own complicated reckoning, made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. Rather than letting his legal team quietly manage the unfolding scandal the way corporations typically do, behind closed doors, with settlement checks and non-disclosure agreements, he chose to fund an independent inquiry into what had actually happened the night of the fire and who actually deserved credit for it. His advisors warned him this could expose a 16-year-old cover-up connected to his own family's company and damage his reputation even further. For the first time in his career, Bradley didn't seem to care about that calculation the way he once would have. Gregory Sanford, sensing the walls closing in, made one last desperate move. He reached out privately to 3 former colleagues who had also benefited indirectly from the company's gratitude after the fire, reminding them of old favors, old silences, old agreements none of them had ever put in writing, and suggested that if his reputation collapsed, theirs would follow soon after. "If I go down," Sanford reportedly told one of them in a phone call, later submitted as evidence, "plenty of other people are going down with me." That threat, meant to buy his silence a little longer, became one of the most damning pieces of evidence ever entered against him. The formal hearing took place 5 weeks later, in a Mecklenburg County courtroom packed well beyond its capacity, with reporters lined up in the hallway and cameras stationed at every legal angle the building allowed. Nathaniel testified first. His voice stayed steady even as visible emotion moved across his face, describing in detail the young woman who had guided him and dozens of trapped workers through a corridor that shouldn't have existed on any official map. He described the wound to her arm, the calm she kept while steel rained down around her, the way she vanished before anyone could properly thank her. He didn't exaggerate a single detail. He didn't need to. The courtroom went completely silent while he spoke, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on the back of your neck. One by one, survivors of the fire took the stand to corroborate his account. Men and women now in their 50s and 60s, who had spent 16 years believing the woman who saved them had vanished forever without ever being recognized. Each described the same details independently, the same severe wound, the same unwavering calm, the same refusal to wait around for thanks once the last worker was clear. A former machine operator named Curtis Webb, now walking with a cane from an unrelated injury, broke down on the stand, describing how the young woman had carried his co-worker's daughter the final stretch toward the exit while flames licked across the ceiling above them, never once raising her voice, never once letting the panic in that building reach her face. Sanford's defense attorney tried to challenge the reliability of memories formed during a traumatic event. But the sheer volume of matching, independent testimony made that argument collapse under its own weight before the judge ever had to rule on it. Documents from the independent inquiry Bradley had funded further dismantled Sanford's account. Internal correspondence from 16 years earlier, in which company executives privately admitted uncertainty about who actually deserved credit for the rescue, and chose Sanford as the public face of the story, largely because he was already an employee in good standing, while the true rescuer remained unidentified and unavailable for comment. It hadn't been one single lie. It had been a slow accumulation of convenient silences. One person after another choosing comfort over honesty, until an entire false history had calcified into accepted fact. Midway through the third day of proceedings, Sanford's own attorney requested a private recess, later confirmed by courtroom staff, to have advised his client that no remaining defense could withstand the weight of testimony already on the record. When the hearing resumed, something in Sanford's face had changed completely. The practiced confidence of the earlier days was gone, replaced by the stillness of a man who finally understood there was no version of this story left for him to control. On the final day, the presiding judge ordered Gregory Sanford's arrest on charges of fraud and falsified testimony connected to his original commendation. Charges that carried the real possibility of significant prison time, given the scope of what he had fraudulently claimed for 16 years. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he was led away in handcuffs, his self-published leadership book still, absurdly, listed at number 4 on a regional bestseller chart that would quietly remove it by that evening. For the first time in 16 years, the public record finally began to reflect what had actually happened inside that burning building. But the hearing wasn't over. And the courtroom's attention had already started shifting toward the man, seated quietly in the third row, watching the foundation of his family's empire come apart and rebuild itself in front of the entire country. When the judge invited any final statements relevant to the proceedings, Bradley Whitfield rose slowly and walked to the front of the courtroom. Fully aware that every camera in the building was now fixed on him, he began, without excuse, without deflection. He said, plainly, that he had struck a woman in public out of arrogance and assumption, that he had judged her instantly based on nothing more than her appearance and his own inflated sense of importance. He said he had spent years believing his success was entirely his own creation, never once questioning the deeper history of a company he had inherited, never once wondering whose sacrifice had quietly protected the empire he so proudly claimed as his own achievement. His voice, normally controlled, normally commanding in every public appearance he'd ever made, wavered as he kept speaking. In front of cameras broadcasting to a national audience, Bradley Whitfield knelt down in the middle of that courtroom and offered a formal apology to Denise Coleman, who sat in the gallery, watching without expression. He spoke of the assistants who had watched him strike her and said nothing, the bystanders who had filmed the moment without stepping in, the culture inside his own company that had, for years, taught everyone around him that challenging him carried more risk than staying silent ever would. He said he understood, now, that the silence in that cafe hadn't been about Denise alone, that it reflected something that had been allowed to rot for years under his leadership, and that fixing it would take a great deal more than one gesture in one courtroom. He announced the creation of a compensation fund for workers and families affected by industrial accidents connected to his company's history, including a direct, long overdue settlement for Denise herself. 16 years late, finally acknowledged. He went further, announcing he would transfer a meaningful percentage of his personal shares in Whitfield Dynamics directly into the Second Chance Workers Alliance, giving it resources far beyond anything it had operated with in its entire existence. The courtroom fell into an unusual hush as everyone waited to see how Denise would respond. A moment most people in that room expected would bring her some visible measure of vindication. Reporters leaned forward, cameras pushed in closer. Even Bradley, still kneeling, seemed uncertain whether her silence meant forgiveness or something else entirely. Watch what she does with her hands right now. Because this is the moment the entire courtroom will still be talking about a year from now. Denise rose from her seat slowly, smoothing the same charcoal coat she'd been wearing the morning everything began, and walked to the front of the courtroom without hesitation. She didn't look at Bradley with anger. She didn't rush to embrace an apology being handed to her in front of the entire country either. Instead, she turned to face the gathered crowd. The reporters, the survivors, the cameras carrying her voice far beyond that room, and began to speak in the same level, unshaken tone she'd used in the cafe 5 weeks earlier. She said she accepted the apology. Not because his words erased what had happened, but because carrying that anger for the rest of her life had never been the kind of person she wanted to become. She thanked the survivors who had come forward to tell the truth. She thanked Nathaniel, who had carried the memory of that night for 16 years, without ever once letting it go. Then she turned toward the wider audience listening, and her voice grew firmer, carrying the full weight of everything she'd held in silence for so long. She told them never to judge a person by the color of their skin, never to assume the worst about someone based on the clothes they wore, or the car they drove, or the neighborhood they came from. She told them the people who quietly change the world rarely look like the people history chooses to celebrate. That quiet sacrifice almost always goes unnoticed, while loud, convenient stories get rewarded instead. She spoke briefly, carefully, about the workers she'd helped over 11 years. A welder who'd lost 2 fingers and couldn't afford the surgery his insurance refused to cover. A young mother working night shifts who broke her back in a fall her employer blamed on her own carelessness. She never used their real names, even now. She said the world was full of people doing extraordinary things in ordinary clothes, and that the failure to notice them said far more about the people looking than it ever said about the people being overlooked. She reminded the room that a scar on someone's arm could mean nothing, or it could mean everything. And the only way to know the difference was to stop assuming and start listening. When she finished, the courtroom rose to its feet in applause that lasted far longer than anyone expected, reporters included, many of them visibly moved by words that carried none of the bitterness they'd braced for. 6 months later, the strip mall office on the edge of Charlotte was gone. The Second Chance Workers Alliance now occupied 2 floors of a renovated warehouse near the rail yards, with satellite offices opening that spring in Raleigh, Columbia, and Knoxville. Donations kept arriving long after the news cycle had moved on to something else entirely, sustained by a steady stream of people who had watched a 5-week-old video and wanted to be part of something that mattered beyond a single viral moment. Nathaniel Cross had left his position guarding executives completely. He spent his days now driving between hospitals and job sites instead of boardrooms and private elevators, working alongside Denise full-time. Finally given the chance to repay a debt he'd carried quietly for 16 years. More than one former colleague noted that he seemed, for the first time in almost 2 decades, genuinely at peace. Whitfield Dynamics released a public report exactly 1 year after the courtroom apology, detailing every change implemented since the hearing, including a permanent department devoted entirely to reviewing historical worker injury claims that had been ignored or dismissed for decades. Critics remained skeptical, pointing out, fairly, that real accountability in a corporation this size usually takes far longer than a single year to prove itself sincere. Bradley never claimed otherwise in a single public remark. He stopped giving the kind of interviews that once defined his public image. The bold predictions, the confident soundbites, and chose instead to speak rarely and carefully, aware now that his words carried a weight he had once taken completely for granted. Denise left the courtroom that day, without waiting for the applause to end, walking out through a side entrance to avoid the crowd of reporters gathered at the main doors. As she stepped into the late afternoon light, a photographer caught one final image that would later run in nearly every article written about her story. Her sleeve pulled back slightly as she adjusted the strap of her old canvas bag, the one that had been mended so many times, the thin, pale scar along her wrist clearly visible in the frame. It was the same scar that had once caused her almost unbearable pain, the same scar that had nearly taken her arm on a December night 16 years earlier. And it was the very thing that ultimately forced an entire city, and eventually an entire country, to remember a truth too easily set aside. A person's worth was never measured by how they appeared when the world happened to be watching. It was measured by what they chose to do in the quiet moments when absolutely no one was.